Developing the knight to f3 immediately contests the center and prepares for kingside castling, offering flexible pawn structure options. Mirroring white's knight development immediately establishes symmetrical central influence, preparing for a flexible game with options for both pawn structures. Preparing to fianchetto the king's bishop, aiming for long-term control of the central diagonals and reinforcing the kingside. Establishing a fianchetto is a solid choice, preparing to either long diagonal and potentially castle kingside without creating immediate weaknesses. Anchoring the center firmly, white prepares to develop his pieces harmoniously and potentially exploit the open central files. Unlocking the diagonal with the bishop solidifies the fianchettoed structure and prepares for future central ambitions. Unleashing central pressure, white seizes space and eyes queenside expansion. Securing the monarch in its cozy corner immediately, a prudent defensive posture that prepares for central maneuvering and avoids premature king exposure. Solidifying the fianchetto, white prepares to dominate the long diagonal, anticipating central pawn pushes. Solidifying the center's pawn structure, this maneuver prepares for kingside expansion and subtly challenges white's queenside control. Solidifying the kingside structure and preparing for potential central pawn breaks demonstrates a commitment to developing a robust position. Now, the focus shifts to activating the remaining pieces, perhaps eyeing the d-file or reinforcing the queenside to counterbalance black's potential counterplay. Developing the knight to d7 solidifies the queenside and prepares for potential pawn advances on the queenside or a central push with e5. This knight often finds a good outpost on c5 or e5 or supports the c-pawn's advance. Developing the knight to c3 solidifies the center and prepares to exert pressure along the semi-open d-file, while also offering an escape square for the king should the queenside come under fire. Challenging the center directly, this pawn advance aims to destabilize white's d4 foothold and open diagonal lines for the queen and bishop, creating immediate central friction. Reinforcing the kingside pawn structure here is a prudent, albeit somewhat passive, choice to preempt any immediate threats from black's developing pieces, particularly if a bg4 maneuver were contemplated. Breaking the pawn chain opens lines for your bishops. Now, focus on developing your queenside pieces to support the center and prepare for potential pawn pushes or piece maneuvers on the kingside. Reclaiming the center with the knight directly confronts black's pawn structure and prepares for further central expansion, hinting at a potential kingside initiative as white's bishop eyes that diagonal. The rook slides into the center, adding pressure along the e-file and preparing to contest control of that crucial open file, potentially unbalancing white's queenside development. Unifying the queen with the rooks across the newly open central files promises increased pressure against black's somewhat cramped king. Unleashing the knight to its most active square, this maneuver instantly challenges white's central pawn structure and opens lines for potential tactical skirmishes. It signals black's intent to aggressively contest the d4 outpost and potentially exploit the light-squared weaknesses that might arise for white. Placing the rook on the d-file aims to contest central control and prepare for potential advances or even a queenside expansion, subtly reinforcing white's central pawn structure and limiting black's knight on c5's influence. Unfurling the queen to e7 aims to consolidate black's central presence and prepare for potential pawn pushes or piece transfers in the coming moves. Sharpening the central control, the bishop's foray to g5 immediately challenges the knight on c5, aiming to disrupt black's delicate coordination and potentially fork pieces if the knight is forced to move, thereby opening up possibilities for white to exploit the light squares. Solidifying the center and preparing for a potential queenside expansion, this maneuver cleverly supports the knight on c5 and builds a more robust pawn chain, anticipating future skirmishes around the d6-e5 diagonal. Steering the rook towards the queenside aims to pressure the b7 pawn and prepare potential queenside expansion, perhaps even a b4-b5 push to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain space on that flank. Opening the queenside flank with this pawn thrust is a bold attempt to disrupt white's harmonious development, aiming to create queenside play where black's knight on c5 previously eyed weaknesses, though it now grants white a potential outpost on b5 and introduces queenside pawn weaknesses that might be exploited later. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure addresses the potential outpost on c5 and prepares to challenge the central dark squares, aiming for a more harmonious piece deployment despite the slight retraction of the b-pawn. Challenging the bishop's imposing diagonal opens up a crucial line for the black queen, subtly preparing for potential piece exchanges and a more active role in the center. Shifting the bishop from its previously secure diagonal to a more active post on the queen side, this maneuver seeks to pin the black knight and potentially disrupt their queenside pawn structure, creating imbalances that might be exploited later. Introducing knight to e4 injects a potent dose of uncertainty into the kingside space, directly challenging white's fianchettoed bishop and aiming to disrupt the harmony of the pawn structure. This maneuver creates immediate tactical skirmishes, forcing white to carefully consider the potential for piece exchanges or further complications. The knight's new outpost now eyes critical squares and can be a launching pad for future attacks. Shattering the perceived symmetry, white initiates a decisive exchange that promises to reshape the central battlefield. By trading knights on e4, the pawn structure in the middle is irrevocably altered, potentially opening critical lines for white's queen and rooks. This is not merely about material balance. It's about creating dynamic imbalances that can be exploited by precise piece play. Observe how the absence of black's knight on that central square might weaken the kingside defense or create new avenues for infiltration. Now black's knight finds a more active square, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially exploit the now weakened light squares around white's king by repositioning towards the d2-g5 diagonal. Seeking to stabilize the central tension, white reroutes the rook to a more active, yet somewhat passive, file, aiming to connect the rooks and potentially support a future pawn advance, while also creating a slight vulnerability on the d-file by withdrawing from the immediate threat of the black knight's advanced position. Disrupting white's queenside ambitions, the knight's adventurous leap to g5 immediately challenges the bishop on f4, threatening to unravel the pawn structure and exploit potential weaknesses around the king. This maneuver attempts to redeploy the knight to a more active square, aiming to disrupt black's central control and prepare for potential pawn pushes on the kingside. Alternatively, a curious repositioning, white abandons the bishop's pressure on c5 in favor of creating a flexible knight outpost, though it remains to be seen if this creates any concrete weaknesses in black's developing structure. Or this rook lift signals an intent to potentially swing across the board, seeking active participation on the queen side or even a surprise attack on the king side should black's defenses become overextended. Consider this. The bishop on g5, having fulfilled its purpose of pinning the knight, is now retreated, allowing the rook to escape the diagonal and hinting at a more dynamic, less passive development for white's heavy pieces. Black reroutes the queen to the d8 square, a retreat signaling a shift in focus towards solidifying the king side and potentially contesting the d-file. This maneuver, while seemingly passive, aims to regroup forces and avoid the immediate pressure white is exerting with the rook on e3. It also offers a subtle threat of future queenside activity should white's central control waver. Unraveling the pawn structure is the immediate consequence of this piece exchange, opening lines that were previously barricaded and potentially creating weaknesses around the black king if black isn't careful with their regrouping. Abandoning the pawn structure for activity, the recapture opens a diagonal for the queen and clears the f-file, but at the cost of creating isolated doubled pawns and potentially weakening the king side. The dust settles on a captured rook, simplifying the battlefield and ushering in a new phase where pawn structure and piece activity become paramount. Accepting the exchange simplifies the position, opening lines for your remaining pieces and potentially creating a more active endgame scenario where your queenside majority might become relevant. Reasserting control over the open file, the rook now stands ready to exploit any defensive weaknesses or support pawn advances down the d-file, a crucial corridor for positional advantage in this simplified structure. Pressing the queenside flank with this pawn advance immediately challenges white's control of the now open queenside files and creates potential weaknesses in white's pawn structure should it be exchanged. Unlocking the queenside becomes the immediate focus as white initiates a bold pawn thrust, aiming to disrupt black's developing structure and potentially gain a foothold on the now open 7th rank. This pawn advances with the intention of either creating passed pawns or forcing concessions from black's pieces. Black's audacious pawn thrust is a bold attempt to disrupt white's pawn structure and gain some outpost potential on the queenside, but it risks weakening the queenside further if white can exploit the advanced pawn's isolation. Consolidating the pawn structure and creating a robust central defense, this move aims to solidify white's position before any potential breakthrough or pawn storm from black. It prepares to advance the central pawns further, potentially opening lines for white's pieces and restricting black's knight on c5, while simultaneously safeguarding the king. A pawn structure is solidified for now, but the knight on d7 faces a somewhat passive post, awaiting a more active role, and the bishop on d7, while defending the pawn, could potentially be a target if white decides to advance further on the queenside. Bringing the knight back to b3 aims to consolidate the queenside and prepare for a potential kingside advance or reinforce the central pawn structure, shifting the focus away from the now-opened queenside files after black's pawn push. Relocating the queen to the queenside aims to prepare for potential pawn pushes and increase activity on that flank, though it does leave the king a touch exposed for now and concedes some central influence. Concentrating the queen to the d3 square offers a new perspective on the central control, aiming to potentially challenge black's pieces on the queenside or support a kingside initiative that has been somewhat dormant. Finally, black repositions the bishop to a more active square, threatening to disrupt white's pawn structure with a potential capture on b3. This maneuver opens up diagonal threats and aims to create counterplay on the queenside, potentially forcing white to address the advanced pawn. Unleashing the central pawn storm shatters black's defensive structure and aims to pry open the kingside, promising a dynamic, potentially tactical, struggle as white seeks to exploit the newly created weaknesses and disrupt black's coordination. Black recenters the bishop, bringing it back into the fray after white's aggressive central push, aiming to solidify the pawn structure and contest the d5 square, which has become a critical battleground. A proactive repositioning of the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to contest the open h-file and potentially support a kingside advance or secure the e2 square. Exploiting the open diagonal to the king, this maneuver seeks to activate the queen for potential infiltration or to support a pawn push, forcing white to consider the newly exposed kingside and the pressure building on their queenside defenses. A subtle repositioning of the rook, aiming to connect the remaining heavy pieces and potentially redeploy to the queenside to challenge black's advanced pawn. Intensifying the queenside pressure, black repositions the queen to a more aggressive square, eyeing potential weaknesses in white's pawn structure and creating opportunities for tactical skirmishes. Capturing the pawn opens lines but invites black's queen to a dangerous outpost, potentially trapping it. Recapturing the bishop immediately solidifies black's pawn structure and avoids a potential king attack by the queen and rook on open files. Seizing the initiative, white aims to disrupt black's queen-rook battery and exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure. Capturing that pawn offers a fleeting material gain, but significantly compromises your pawn structure on the queenside, potentially leaving those pawns isolated and vulnerable for the ensuing endgame. Asserting dominion over the central files, the rook's repositioning initiates a direct confrontation, aiming to dislodge black's influential bishop and gain uncontested passage through the now-opened c-file. Recapturing the pawn with the bishop redirects pressure towards the kingside, a bold attempt to disrupt white's rook on the now-open d-file and potentially create attacking chances if white isn't careful with king's safety. The queen's foray to c3 might appear aggressive, but it surrenders tempo and opens up lines that could be exploited. Black's bishop now controls the crucial a2-g8 diagonal, and the a-pawn is a persistent nuisance. Accepting the pawn on c3 completely alters the pawn structure, creating a passed pawn for black and simplifying into an endgame where white's material advantage should eventually tell. But black's active queen can pose immediate threats. Recapturing the pawn seals the queen's rook's fate, ushering in a material advantage and a simplified position where white can focus on activating their remaining pieces and potentially creating a passed pawn. The rook's journey to the queenside opens up the critical file for potential infiltration, aiming to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses for the king. Securing the monarch with a modest advance, white initiates a defensive maneuver, preparing to consolidate the weakened queenside pawns while acknowledging the present stalemate of activity. Unlocking the queenside pawn chain suddenly creates dynamic possibilities. Exploiting the open file, this capture seizes the initiative on the queenside, forcing black to defend their advanced pawn and potentially creating weaknesses in their pawn structure as they recapture. Capturing the pawn opens a diagonal for black's rook to potentially exploit the now undefended light squares around white's king, creating immediate attacking possibilities. Reclaiming central squares and preparing a pawn push seems to be the idea behind maneuvering the knight back to its starting square. Sensing an opportunity, black repositions the bishop to better defend the queenside pawns and prepare for potential activity on the kingside, aiming to solidify their position before further pawn advances. Retreating the rook to the c-file allows for a potential rook lift to the fourth rank, or simply reinforces the defense of that crucial file against black's advancing pawn structure. Seizing control of the open b-file presents a compelling counter-strategy, aiming to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and potentially initiate an exchange that eases black's positional burden. A strategic repositioning to control the crucial central squares and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside. A bold repositioning of the bishop, aiming to utilize the newly opened diagonal and potentially disrupt white's coordination on the queenside, while simultaneously reinforcing the pawns. Seeking a safer haven for the monarch, the king shuffles towards the kingside flank, aiming to escape the queenside's pawn storm and find respite behind its own advancing infantry. Acquiring the bishop on c1 is a crucial step toward dismantling white's defensive structure and unleashing the rook on a4 to its full potential along the now open rank. The rook's return to the first rank solidifies control of the open file, a crucial territorial advantage as we enter this simplified, yet still dynamic position. The rook's repositioning to the second rank aims to contest the open file and potentially disrupt white's queenside pawn structure, while simultaneously preparing to support a future advance of the b-pawn. The monarch ventures forth from its cozy defensive shell, seeking to participate actively in the endgame fray and support the advancing pawns. Black snatches a pawn, but opens up the queenside pawns to white's infiltration and severs a vital connection between their pieces. Unleashing a pawn storm, white aims to disrupt black's well-coordinated pieces and potentially create weaknesses around the enemy king, leveraging the open central files. Sacrificing the pawn in this endgame opens up critical lines for your remaining pieces, aiming to exploit white's potentially exposed king and weakened pawn structure on the kingside. Unleashing a pawn chain reaction, this capture initiates a dramatic shift in pawn structure, potentially opening aggressive lines toward black's king. Seizing the pawn offers a dynamic shift, but invites a potentially sharp counterplay as the white king now ventures forward, creating a delicate balance between material gain and king safety. Unleashing the pawn breaks open the kingside, creating immediate attacking potential and a dynamic imbalance. The pawn grab on f5, while seemingly regaining material equality, fundamentally alters the structural integrity of black's position by creating a permanent weakness on g5. Opening the passed pawn's path creates immediate queenside pressure, forcing black to dedicate significant resources to its containment. The pawn structure around black's king is now severely compromised, and this defensive maneuver only highlights that weakness, offering no hope of active counterplay. King Hunt initiated, forcing the black monarch to the edge of the board, revealing its vulnerability as the white rook slices through the open file. The king desperately seeks shelter from the open files as the rook aggressively probes the 7th rank. A decisive thrust opens a critical diagonal, forcing the black king into an exposed position and setting up a mating net. Seeking refuge for the king, black consolidates defensive lines around the monarch, acknowledging the persistent pressure from the white rook now dominating the 7th rank. The rook immediately takes up an aggressive posting on the 7th rank, eyeing the weak pawns and creating immediate pressure on black's position. The bishop's repositioning to g8 aims to secure the weakened kingside, offering a potential defensive shield while also eyeing a return to the center, or perhaps even aiming for h7 if the opportunity arises, though it sacrifices immediate central influence. Initiating a decisive mating net, the rook glides to the 8th rank, aiming to corner the enemy monarch with relentless pressure. The king's forced march to the corner is a desperate attempt to find refuge, but it feels more like stepping into a spotlight. White's rook now enjoys unobstructed access to a critical open file, posing immediate threats to black's compromised defenses. This maneuver fundamentally alters the landscape of the game, exposing weaknesses that were previously concealed. The initiative has definitively shifted, and black must now engage in a precarious dance to survive. The king is being harried across the board, and this check is a vital maneuver to keep the opponent's monarch on the defensive, preventing any comfortable regrouping or counterplay. The king's dash towards the queenside, seeking refuge behind its pawns, unfortunately exposes it to the relentless pressure on the open diagonal. This aggressive rook deployment forces black's king into a particularly exposed position, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside created by the earlier pawn exchange. Seeking sanctuary for the monarch involves navigating a minefield of attacking pawns and open lines, a precarious dance that prioritizes royal safety above all else. Sacrificing a pawn to forcibly open the h-file creates immediate pressure on black's king and should lead to a swift conclusion. Sacrificing the pawn on h4 opens the h-file, but at the cost of exposing the king further and surrendering a vital defensive pawn, potentially leading to a swift, decisive attack by white's rook and knight. The rook boldly invades the back rank, threatening to dismantle black's defenses by forking the king and pawn. The pawn's desperate lunge forward, aiming to become a queen, fundamentally ignores the immediate threat of the rook's infiltration. King Hunt continues with a forceful check that seeks to shepherd the opponent's monarch towards a precarious corner, maximizing the attacking potential of white's remaining pieces through a coordinated advance. King's desperate chase for escape, forcing the rook to a controlling position on the 7th rank, sacrificing a pawn to maintain offensive pressure and corner the monarch. Targeting the exposed monarch with a timely check, aiming to disrupt black's defensive structure and potentially force material concessions. Embracing the active rook forces a significant decision. The rook's repositioning prepares to exploit the exposed black king, aiming to advance down the 7th rank and create mating threats. The pawn on b3 now stands as a vulnerable outpost, demanding immediate attention as it begins to march forward, potentially disrupting white's defensive structure and offering a path for black's remaining forces to penetrate. This move aims to solidify the bishop's position on the queenside, potentially preparing to support the rook's advance and clamp down on black's passed pawn. Re-establishing the bishop's defensive posture on the queenside, this maneuver intends to shore up the pawn chain and potentially prepare for a more active role in the endgame, perhaps by supporting a kingside pawn push or influencing the central structure indirectly. Unlocking the pawn chain is the key, creating a dangerous pathway for your rook. The rook now occupies the h2 square, setting up a potential battery with the queen on the h-file and aiming to exploit the king's exposed position by creating mating threats on the back rank. The king abandons its defensive post, marching into the fray to assist in the promotion race. This sacrifice opens a crucial diagonal for the rook, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create passed pawns for black. Pushing the king forward into this chaos is a desperate gamble, as white is seeking a mating attack by sacrificing material. Initiating a dangerous counterplay with the rook, black aims to exploit the exposed white monarch, potentially creating complex tactical scenarios and forcing concessions from white's advanced pawn structure. Finally, the white king bravely steps into the fray, embracing the newly opened lines to support the pawn push and hunt down black's past threat. The black rook finds a curious outpost, disrupting white's pawn structure and aiming to create chaos on the queenside before the white king can find safety from the advancing pawn.